Welcome everyone to London CND's annual conference for 2022. I'm going to explain a little about that in a moment. We've got two panels, a great lineup of speakers which I'll tell you about, but I'm just going to give people a moment to sign on. Participants are still joining us on the webinar. It's also live streamed on Facebook. So if you're watching us from Facebook, hello and welcome to. During the Zoom seminar, you can ask your questions of the panelists via the Q&A. You're very welcome to do that, and also to introduce yourself by the Q&A if you wish to. And if you're on Facebook, then we won't be seeing your questions on the Zoom, but you will be able to leave your comments. Thanks everyone, thanks very much indeed for attending. I'm looking forward to an excellent couple of hours. So I'm just going to go silent for about 30 seconds or a minute now while the rest of the participants join us. And in fact, perhaps rather than going silent, I'll say hello to the people I recognise. David Leal from South East London CND and an activist in London. I can see Daniel Blaney, who's one of the CND vice chairs. Welcome, Daniel. Helen Martins. Joan Griffiths. Oh, and John McGrath. Welcome, John. I'll point out to one of our speakers from the US, Margaret Kimberley, that John is also a fellow American, and he's part of the Democratic Socialist chapter in Britain, and often joins us for these sorts of activities. Hello, John Morris, who's also a committee member of London CND. Welcome. And I'm beginning to see, hello Paul Steele and Pauline Fraser. I'm beginning to see now people joining from across the country. We've got people from the Midlands, from the north of England. And we've got people from other campaigns. Welcome VJ, nice to see you. Okay, so I'm going to start. Just a short introduction to tell you what it's about and a couple of housekeeping points. So Britain under Boris, rebuilding global security versus real security. And as everyone on the call, or every person living in Britain on the call, will recognise that rebuilding global Britain comes from a remark by our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, when he introduced the integrated review, that he was intending to make Britain great again, for which read rearm militarily. So we're going to be talking about what is the single most important strategic political issue in the world today, and that is the growing confrontation between the United States and China and Britain's role in that. I know that many of us on this call will recognise it and name it for what it is, a Cold War on China by the United States and by Britain. Boris Johnson's government is firmly lined up behind the US. No surprise there, of course. The integrated review of March last year announced a massive 44% increase in the UK's nuclear weapons stockpile, as well as a big expansion of the military budget, 10% or more inflation-proofed during the lifetime of this Parliament. And chillingly, the integrated review also expanded the circumstances under which the UK would be prepared to use or threaten to use its nuclear arsenal, which now include non-nuclear conflicts. This puts Britain in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and CND is taking action on this. We may hear something about that from Tom Unterrainer a little later on in this Zoom meeting. We're all too well aware that this military build-up comes at a time when resources should be focused on combating climate change and on controlling the COVID pandemic and funding the health service. And that's why CND's slogans, nurses not nukes, NHS not trident, have been so popular throughout last year and continue to be so. And if anyone had any doubts watching the news this week, of course, we know just how important COVID isn't to Boris Johnson and his cabinet. Okay, so just to repeat for those who joined us a few minutes after the start, this is being live streamed on Zoom, and you can use the Q&A to type in the questions you'd like to ask panelists. It's also being live streamed on Facebook. You can't ask your questions, but you can make comments as we go along. And also look out for a variety of links about the speakers and their organisations as we go through this event. So let me introduce the first panel, which takes the name of the conference title. And we've got three absolutely terrific speakers. We have Jeremy Corbyn. Welcome, Jeremy. A Vice President of CND and former leader of the Labour Party. Most of you know him. He needs little introduction. We've got Margaret Kimberley from the States and Warren Smith from Australia. And I've got to pause here and say thank you very much to both of them. Margaret's up at 5 in the morning to join us. We might catch a yawn or two from Warren, who's staying up beyond his bedtime. So thanks very much indeed. We really appreciate the way in which you've expanded and internationalized the discussion. Thank you. So I suggest our running order is Warren, followed by Margaret, followed by Jeremy. I'm going to chair the session, and then there's going to be plenty of time for question and answers. So Warren Smith is the Deputy National Secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia. They've opposed AUKUS. They've put out an absolutely smashing statement. You'll get a link to that. And Warren is the main speaker on AUKUS. So I'd like to invite him now to speak for about 10 minutes on the issue of the conference. Over to you, Warren. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Comrade Chair. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I speak, the Bidjigal people, and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, recognising it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to thank CND for the invitation to speak at your conference and wish you all the very best in your ongoing struggles to build a world of peace and social justice. I bring warm solidarity greetings from the Maritime Union of Australia to the British peace movement. The MUA represents seafarers, dockers and port workers. We are a product of many amalgamations, the main ones historically being the merging of the Waterside Workers Federation and the Seamen's Union of Australia in 1993 to form the Maritime Union of Australia. Since 2018, the MUA is a division of the larger Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union. We are greatly encouraged to be working with you to oppose this dreadful and dangerous AUKUS pact and the nuclear threat that comes with it. In the case of Australia, that is partly through the acquisition of nuclear submarines, making Australia the only non-nuclear power to have these weapons of mass destruction. We would like to defeat that proposition and are working with a range of forces in Australia to build an anti-AUKUS movement that can lead, energise and unite us in this campaign. In World War II, 1 in 8 Australian seafarers were killed. They went to work, they went to war. Wharfies, what you might call dockers, in 1938 refused to load pig iron to Japan in Port Cymru and Sydney. They said it would come back as bombs and bullets, and it did. In 1942, 33 wharfies were killed in the bombing of Darwin. These events have instilled in our union's policy the critical question of peace and a recognition of how it is workers who pay for wars and the tyranny of the ruling class. We have a long-held position in the union that peace is union business, and that has seen the union actively oppose the Korean and Vietnam wars, where seafarers refused to sail to Boonaroo, carrying munitions to Vietnam, and wharfies refused to load arms on the Japarat, walking off the job. We opposed the war for oil in Iraq and the illegal and immoral war in Afghanistan. Today, we voice our opposition to the AUKUS Pact and the rampant drive to war led by Biden, Johnson, and that fella from down under, you know, the sexist, racist, moronic one who talks in tongues, Morrison. And for our union, opposing AUKUS and the drive to war with China was obvious. We're seeing a military escalation of enormous magnitude in the Asia-Pacific region, which seems predicated on resources and markets, on corporate greed. The cost to Australia of escalating international tensions with the nuclear submarines is around $171 billion. Well, last week, I couldn't walk out the door and get a PCR test because they had virtually closed all the sites down due to them being overwhelmed. It's near impossible to get a rapid antigen test with some heavy price gouging going on. And Morrison comes out and says emphatically the government won't make them free. But this Morrison government will spend $171 billion on attack weapons, as well as letting US troops trample all over the place as a staging ground for war. These subs don't defend. They are predators of war. We don't need weapons. We need more nurses, more doctors, more teachers and COVID-safe schools. More of these frontline workers would be a pittance of the preposterous cost for the nuclear submarines, and it will be more. The anti-AUKUS campaign provides a huge opportunity for us to bring together a wide array of forces. The environment, for example, is one. On a purely ecological basis, putting a nuclear reactor into the sea is not one of humankind's wisest moments. I know that first-hand workers don't want nuclear reactors and possibly weapons in the ports they are working, and why would they? The nuclear industry is salivating at the possibility of a burgeoning nuclear industry in Australia. There isn't nuclear power in Australia at the moment, and we would like to keep it that way. But nuclear submarines open the door. We already see advocates of nuclear power falsely promoting it is a green source of energy, when in reality, it is an environmentally devastating process and a dangerous source of energy, creating problems for generations into the future. Nuclear waste dumps in Australia have also proceeded on the basis of struggle. Sites have often been declared on sacred traditional lands opposed by communities, but also broad movements, including support from unions, and this is set to intensify. I want to touch on the questions of jobs. The jobs argument is often used to tie unions into horrible proposals that are often not sustainable and are antisocial. In considering our opposition to AUKUS, we have proposed that the Adelaide shipyards and other sites be repurposed for the building of an Australian merchant fleet that would be socially, economically and sustainable, and use only a portion of the funds that AUKUS requires. Australia has the fourth largest shipping task in the world, yet not one container is carried on an Australian flagged or crewed vessel. At the same time, there are huge supply chain delays due to the undercapacity in international shipping due to ship owner monopolisation and price gouging. So supply chains, common delays are common internationally at present, with huge global demand for online goods due to COVID. Now, control of a national fleet could deal with many of the supply chain issues currently faced in Australia and would create many times the jobs that would come about on a nuclear submarine. The union has also called for the building of renewable energy and offshore wind turbines to ensure we prevent global heating from exceeding 1.5 degrees C. Offshore wind has been a big campaign of our union, and we see it as a form of transition from oil and gas field jobs and vessels into offshore wind. The vessels are essentially the same. We are now facing pro-nuclear arguments seeking to undermine the offshore wind projects, but they are, however, still moving ahead quite positively. When Australia was engulfed in huge firestorms, Morrison went on holidays to Hawaii. The huge fires showed enormous gaps in the firefighting capacity needed to save lives from inescapable fires caused by climate change. So when a government makes a decision to not spend on critical infrastructure, health, schools, hospitals, and doesn't back in the workers who have kept society functioning during the pandemic, you know they're not on the side of the people. They have chosen to back in corporate warfare, war for profit, and they must be opposed. The warmongers in Canberra openly talk up war with China. It's crazy stuff. And we should ask, what about war on COVID? What about a war on homelessness or a war on poverty? Rallies around Australia were held in December, calling for no nuclear subs, no to AUKUS, and no to war on China. The broad array of speakers was reflective of the capacity to draw in large numbers and build a movement in opposition to this drive to war. Building a coalition to oppose the AUKUS is a good first step and combined unions, the wider peace movement, environmental groups, and anti-nuclear groups. Plans are underway for more action, and we look forward to campaigning with you in that struggle. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Warren. And isn't it remarkable how the Australian and British priorities intermesh in that lovely speech that we've heard just now? We will be returning to the issue of climate change and of jobs and just transition in the second panel. Let me now introduce Margaret Kimberley from the United States, from New York. And Margaret is speaking today as a leading member of the Black Alliance for Peace in the USA. She's co-founder and executive editor of Black Agenda, and she's author of Prejudential: Black America and the Presidents, which I think gives us all a little soupçon of an indication of the sort of things that Margaret is likely to be talking about. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carol. Greetings, everyone. My name's Margaret Kimberley, and I'd first like to thank the London Region Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very important issue, Global Britain versus real security. I'm not from the UK, but that's just as well, actually. I'm from the United States, the country which the UK follows in every aspect of its foreign policy decision-making. And that gives me an important perspective on these issues. When I first heard the term Global Britain, I immediately saw it as the type of marketing used in modern day politics that at first glance sounds benign, but knowing its origin makes one suspicious. I wasn't aware that the UK ever ceased to be a global player in the world. The sun never set on the empire, and the impacts of colonization, political, economic, and cultural are still being felt. Britain is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a nuclear power. So why the phrase Global Britain? What does the UK want to influence at this moment, and how does it want to do it? It's important to discuss the impact that past foreign policy decisions have had on present day circumstances. One example is the migration crisis embroiling Britain and France at this moment. Refugees fleeing Western Asia and Africa attempt dangerous crossings of the Mediterranean. that are sometimes followed by efforts to reach the UK. This human rights catastrophe is a direct result of an action carried out by global Britain and France in concert with other nations. In 2011, those two countries, the US and the rest of NATO, embarked on a plan to destroy the nation of Libya. They succeeded in doing just that, turning the most prosperous African nation into ruin and killing thousands of people in the process. NATO used jihadist proxies to wage what can only be called a race war against African migrants in that country and against darker-skinned Libyans. The president of Libya was murdered in broad daylight by these same forces. They defeated Libya's military because the UK, US, and France all supported a United Nations Security Council resolution establishing a no-fly zone. To their discredit, China and Russia chose not to veto. Instead, they abstained, and in so doing may as well have voted yes. The no-fly zone accomplished what it was meant to, the defeat of President Gaddafi's army. After Libya was destroyed, Prime Minister Cameron showed up personally, along with French President Sarkozy, to celebrate on Gaddafi's grave and gloat about their role in a war of aggression. That's global Britain. And that is just one example of why this idea must be opposed. We must be clear that phrases intended to obscure actions of this kind must be condemned along with the acts themselves, even when the outcome is sometimes somewhat comical, as in the case of the AUKUS alliance. AUKUS is another linguistic invention for what already exists. The US, UK, and Australia are already allies. US troops are deployed in Australia, and it's the home of one of the largest US surveillance posts in the world, in the city of Pine Gap. Australia is pursuing an anti-China policy conceived in Washington and London. When the leaders of those countries sought to rebrand what they already had, they ended up cutting France out of a defense deal with Australia. The French president withdrew his ambassadors, and Joe Biden had to apologize to Emmanuel Macron. It would be funny if it weren't so ludicrous, and if it didn't expose the dangers of imperialist powers doing what they've always done. The AUKUS announcement debacle points out something very important. The people who are thought of as world leaders just aren't very smart. Boris Johnson was the driving force behind this effort, and he wasn't savvy enough to see that a submarine deal with Australia would be problematic for France. Joe Biden and his team again displayed monumental incompetence. When Biden met Macron, he ended up mumbling something about thinking his staff had informed the French government about this new badly planned arrangement. And that means our lives are in the hands of people who not only represent the most retrograde forces in the world, but they aren't even very clever either. And I know the nations I've mentioned love to boast endlessly about being democracies, but if the people's needs aren't being met, the word has no meaning. Today, we're discussing security. What is security? The average person feels secure with living wage work, a roof over their heads, medical care when they need it, and opportunities for education. When the people I have mentioned talk about security, they mean nothing of the sort. There's no security for the citizens of these countries who live under the threat of war and who are deliberately deprived of their most basic needs. There is none for the people whose interests are used as pretexts for war. There's none for the people of Syria, for example, which NATO attempted to turn into another Libya. Having failed to do that, they punish with unilateral coercive measures, sanctions, depriving that government of the ability to conduct international financial transactions, and thus depriving people of medical care and food. Sanctions are war by other means, and because they carry out collective punishment against civilian populations, are a violation of the Geneva Conventions. There's no security for people who live in targeted nations. When prime ministers and presidents speak of security, the word is invariably followed by dangerous decision-making. The UK sends vessels to the Black Sea to threaten Russia, or the South China Sea to threaten China. In fact, neither country is really threatened, but they make clear that they will defend their interests. And that means that even nonsensical foreign policy theater can have unforeseen consequences. Global Britain and its partner, the US, are doing that with their talk of a non-existent Russian invasion of Ukraine. For weeks, we've been told that Russia is poised to invade Ukraine, an action that would make no sense and which contradicts everything that Russia has done since the 2014 NATO-led coup against the elected president of that country. Any instigation is being carried out by NATO, who are hoping to use their vassal state Ukraine to attack the breakaway region of the Donbass, which opposes the NATO-installed government. They hope to then goad Russia into defending the Donbass. This plan makes as little sense as the establishment of the AUKUS alliance. We are governed by arrogant people with base motives who also control nuclear stockpiles. There should be negotiations among all nuclear nations to reduce the number of weapons and to ban their use. Instead, we have the Bidens and Johnsons of the world taking actions which increase the likelihood of what must never be considered: nuclear war. We need respect for international law and diplomacy. When London and Washington go on and on about values, it is because they want to continue their acts of illegality and their threats against peace. I come to you today as a coordinating committee member of the Black Alliance for Peace. Our organization was founded in 2017 with the goal of reviving the Black radical tradition in the US. And of course, we oppose imperialism in all of its forms. Most of our members reside in the US, where 60% of federal discretionary spending is allocated for the Defense Department. This imperative to take the people's public resources and to carry out aggression around the world is a bipartisan project in this country. Democrats and Republicans alike funded the Pentagon to the tune of $770 billion in the most recent budget. Even members of Congress who call themselves left or progressives are willing partners in this ongoing disaster. Defense spending increases have the same result everywhere: austerity for human needs, but the war machine is fed. Black Alliance for Peace is dedicated to closing the more than 800 US and NATO military bases all over the world, and to disbanding the US Africa Command, AFRICOM, which destabilizes nations from Libya to Ethiopia and beyond, using a war on terror as a fig leaf to wage wars of terror against the democratic rights of people who live on that continent. Anyone who wants peace and security must be anti-imperialist. The term Global Britain was invented because it sounds better than imperialism. But of course, that is exactly what it describes. We cannot have security of any kind as long as supposed democracies dedicate themselves to carrying out violence all over the planet. Opposing these acts is the only way to achieve true security for us all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Thank you very much indeed. That was a really worldwide sweep, and we're very grateful for that input. Just before I call Jeremy to speak, I want to make a brief apology, if I may, and that is to the colleague on the call who asked about captions for people who have hearing difficulties. I'm really sorry. That's not a facility that we have at the moment. We are looking into it, but I'm sure, as you appreciate, resources are limited, and some of the aspects of Zoom are quite expensive. So apologies for that. But when we put out the videos, which we're planning to do, which are clips of this conference, we will pay attention to captions. Okay, our third and final panelist doesn't need much introduction. Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party, a member of CND since he was a teenager, and currently one of our vice presidents. But I just did want to take the opportunity to mention something that maybe not everyone on the call is aware of. And that is, as well as his parliamentary duties and looking after his constituency in North London, Jeremy has founded and is the leader of the Project for Peace and Security. And details of that will be coming up in the chat as he speaks. Thanks very much for joining us, Jeremy. Over to you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you very much to CND and to you, Carol, for all you do, particularly in the international sphere of making sure that CND links up with people all over the world. And I guess the COVID pandemic has actually concentrated our minds on how easy it is to communicate with each other across the globe. And I think we should be very, very grateful to Warren and Margaret for disrupting their normal Sunday to be on this call today, and it's an absolute pleasure to be alongside them on this call. And I want to say, when Warren was speaking, I was thinking of that great tradition of Australian trade unionists that have opposed war and have opposed environmental destruction. And I'm sure Warren would be aware of him, maybe not so many others on the call, the late great Harry Munday, one of the building workers leaders who opposed environmental destruction around Sydney by greedy property developers. And so it is in that fantastic tradition of Australian trade unions that I was so pleased to see Warren on the call. Thanks, Warren, for what you said and the way that you put it. And Margaret, thank you for what you said and the way you put it, because the importance of the way in which the anti-colonial struggle, the way in which the Black consciousness movement and the way in which Black Lives Matters feeds absolutely into the demands for world peace and understanding is clearly part of it. And I must say, I'm sure you were as shocked as I was when President Biden sent an enormous defense budget to Congress for their approval. And Congress not only accepted all of his proposals, but actually added quite a bit to it. So President Biden got an even bigger defense budget than he wanted, and presumably he's now thinking of what to do with the surplus money that the Congress voted for him. And this at a time of a pandemic. And so I just want to say a few things about that and about tensions around the world. And Carol, again, thank you for what you said about the Peace and Justice Project that we set up exactly a year ago. 50,000 people have signed up for it, and we're very active on supporting trade union struggles, international solidarity issues. And I've just come back from Mexico, and we're very pleased with much of the progress being made across Latin America by progressive people. But it's also about challenging media control and media ownership. It is about activating the left to give them a sense of optimism of what we can achieve in this world. Now, on the issues that we're discussing today, the first one has got to be obviously the AUKUS Pact. The AUKUS Pact has to be put within the context of global Britain. Now, Boris Johnson invented this term global Britain because I think, as both Margaret and Warren have pointed out, that if you said we're going to recreate the British Empire, well, some of the liberal media in Britain might be slightly upset by that term, and I guess that it wouldn't be seen as being too acceptable. But global Britain, somehow or other, sounds acceptable. The reality is this: Britain has just increased its defense budget by 24 billion, has cut its overseas aid budget, has cut funding to local authorities, thus social services and so many other very important services are being cut, has presided over a real terms cut in the living standards of all public sector workers. And for the majority of working class people, they've seen a loss of income over the past 10 years, ever since the post-banking crisis austerity came along. And so we have a government that's pretty clear in what direction it's going. Increase the gap between the richest and the poorest, spend more on arms expenditure, and recreate a sort of post-imperial myth about Britain's role in the world. And one of the biggest problems I had as leader of the party was the attacks I received, not so much for the domestic policies that I put forward, which were of public ownership of utilities and redistribution of wealth and improvement of living standards, but it was particularly because of my views on international politics. And when I, in an interview in 2015, said that I would not use nuclear weapons because I believe them to be wrong, I believe it to be immoral, and I believe that they cannot be in any sense targeted. They are weapons of mass destruction that will kill millions of people. Within 2 days, the British newspapers completely contradict themselves. One of them said I was a grave danger to the country's security because I was not prepared to use nuclear weapons. And then the next day they said I was a threat to world security because somebody like me would have their finger on the nuclear button. Well, it can't be both. You can't be a threat and a threat for not using or using. And so the arguments against nuclear weapons to me are absolutely overwhelming. And I'll be looking forward to the issues surrounding the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty at the review conferences. And I think we should spend a bit of time thinking about how we can promote the Global Ban Treaty, because the British media, and I suspect the media in the US and Australia, probably glory in the idea that somehow or other there is security in nuclear weapons, and that Australia has now got itself under the nuclear umbrella. Well, I guess it's always been under the nuclear umbrella as it promotes these tensions with China. But many other places all around the world simply don't see it that way. When the New Zealand government all those years ago opposed French nuclear testing in the Pacific and banned the French Navy from using New Zealand ports to undertake those tests, it was highly controversial at the time, but New Zealand withdrew itself from the whole nuclear scenario. And now I talk to politicians of all parties in New Zealand, and not one of them wants to get back into that whole business of nuclear weapons. The whole political debate has completely changed as a result of it. And look at the numbers of countries that have signed the Global Ban Treaty, and you see the power and strength of it. A couple other things I'd just like to draw attention to. Britain has been very close to the United States in foreign policy, basically ever since the First World War. Mainly because of the economic dependence on the United States loans from the First World War and in the interwar years, and obviously from the formation of NATO in 1948 onwards. And that close relationship has led Britain into a succession of conflicts. Whilst not directly involved in the Vietnam War, Britain did politically support the US in that conflict, but we were involved directly in Korea. We were involved in a whole lot of post-Second World War colonial wars, such as Malaya and Kenya and other places. And we were quite clearly involved in the Gulf War and in the Iraq War. And Tony Blair was absolutely instrumental in the post-2001 response of going to war in Afghanistan. And I was one of millions who opposed particularly the Iraq War. And when I gave a formal apology on behalf of my party, the Labour Party, for involvement in the Iraq War, that was the most intense day of pressure on me to resign as leader of the party, because they did not want me to go ahead with that statement, which I'd pledged I would do and did. And so there is an opportunity for a voice for peace out there. There is an opportunity to do things in a better and different way. So let's just examine very briefly the AUKUS Pact. What's it about? China is a major economic power, obviously. China has substantial armed forces, obviously. All that is very well known. Britain, United States and Australia decided to develop the AUKUS Pact, which means that Boris Johnson turned his head on the 1966 Wilson Doctrine of end of East of Suez policy and gradual retrenchment of British military presence back towards Europe and Britain. Turned his head on that, then set up this thing, Global Pact, in order to create actually tensions and pressure on China. The response of China is going to be pretty obvious. Whatever President Xi's personal views or personal wishes on this, he'll be under pressure from the Chinese military and those that manufacture arms in China to build up, do more, and tensions will rise. And at some point, somewhere, something will go wrong. There'll be a mistake, whatever, and a conflict or a proxy war will break out. In exactly the same way as the buildup of forces on both sides of the Russia-Ukraine border and the expansion of NATO eastwards leads to increased tension. It leads to pressure by the arms manufacturers and others in Europe and the United States to build up a military presence and to arm all those border states. And whatever Putin's personal views on it are, it means that the Russian military and the Russian arms manufacturers will do exactly the same. The tensions will rise and rise and rise. And at some point, something's going to go wrong. There's going to be a mistake, and there's going to be yet another proxy war. This is an incredibly dangerous scenario we're faced at the present time. And this direction is simply not very sensible. We're not yet out of the COVID pandemic. We've only just got over COP26 and the environment questions that were being discussed and debated there. What matters in the world? The ability of people to eat, children to be educated, and when you're sick, to get health care. They're the fundamentals of life. That's what real security is. And the COP26, whilst disappointing in its overall outcome, was exciting in the sense of civic society, people that got involved in it, and the hopes and ambitions of people for a more sustainable world. If we're pouring billions into arms manufacture and increasing tensions, it's simply not possible that the funds will be there to develop healthcare or the important investments in sustainable energy and technology, and an understanding that our survival on this planet also depends on our interaction with the natural world. And so I think there are huge opportunities ahead for the peace movement to bring together the issues of poverty, bring together the issues of environmental destruction, of health discrimination, and the growing thirst for a better understanding of our history and where we've all come from. And so the role of CND has always been to promote peace and understanding and education that goes with it, but it's also about solidarity, and that solidarity is a solidarity for peace. And we're very much part of that movement in this country and around the world. And whilst the mainstream media might seek permanently to disempower us, the opposite is the case. We're empowered by our beliefs, empowered by our sense of unity and strength. And I hope that in this year, we stop being shy and stop being cautious about the demand for peace and build that global strength of global unity to oppose war and to oppose the nuclearization of this planet. The other alternative is desperately dangerous.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very much, Jeremy, from all of us. I now going to move on to Q&A. Just before I do, let's say hello to a couple of new latecomers to the Zoom meeting. Emma Dempcode, who's an excellent councillor in Kensington in London and also one of the vice presidents of London CND. Welcome, Emma. And Murad Qureshi, who is also a CND supporter and a former member of the London Assembly, the Government of London. So welcome to both of you. the time now, friends, to put your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to turn to the first one, which is from Pauline Fraser. Thanks, Pauline. And she says it's specifically, it's a question for Warren. Is the MUA is the MUA talking to trade unions in the UK to create united opposition to the AUKUS Pact?
Yes, we are, and we're also doing the same thing at home, and trying to build, because we think it's pretty important to a big struggle and a big movement that's going to turn around something as monumental as AUKUS. It really does need to have the trade unions backing it in a big way, and we recognise that and are trying to advocate to the extent that we can, amongst other unions, that it's in everyone's interest to join in the campaign to oppose it. There are no jobs in it, and it's an environmental and a social disaster for us all.
Thanks, Warren. I've got a question from, I've got a lot of greetings from people. I'll read those out, some of them at the end if we've got time. I've got a question from, sorry, I'm just looking at a notification. I've got a question about the UK relations, that sort of to ask you to comment on what you think about the so-called special relationship of Britain. And if I can be cheeky and just say a word of that myself before I call our speakers in, I think it's very well known in the peace movement, if not elsewhere, that the so-called cultural and language closeness of the two countries is a bit of a myth, far from a reality. And the reality is that our relationship between those two countries is very firmly based on nuclear exchange and sharing of intelligence, sharing of spying. So let's start with Margaret. What's your view from New York of the special relationship, Margaret?
Oh, special. How special is it? I agree with what you just said. There's a relation of capital. The U.S. has always, it's a mutual aid, so to speak, of the United States helping Britain in their imperial adventures, Britain supporting the U.S. and whatever it wants to do. And now, you know, the UK is, and other European countries are like vassals of the US. Whatever the US says, they do without any question. Do they really care? I just came from Nicaragua late last night. And, you know, there's this need to condemn the Nicaraguan government because do they really care? Do people in London really care? Do people in the EU really care? I doubt very much. The US shouldn't care that what kind of government people in that country choose for themselves. But the special relationship is usually something, the things that they support, one country for the other, it's usually something very bad. So Americans are led to believe this is a good thing, this special relationship with the mother country and so forth. But between our two governments, it's generally something that is very harmful to people somewhere in the world, something very dangerous, where people in the UK lose their sovereignty because their leadership feel like they have to follow the United States. And always something very dubious between the two countries, where some of the worst crimes in the world, where each country will support the other. So this idea of a special relationship between the two countries is, it's like the term global Britain. It's marketing meant to cover up things that are generally very, very bad.
Thanks, Margaret. Jeremy, do you want to comment?
Very briefly, I think Margaret summed it up quite well. I once asked Tony Blair during the run-up to the Iraq War, I said, Tony, what is the nature of the special relationship between Britain and the USA, and how does it work? And he sort of stared at the meeting for a couple of minutes and then said, if I told you what it was, it wouldn't work. I can't give you an answer to that question because it's so special. Well, yeah, what we have is a sharing of nuclear technology, which originally was unique between Britain and the USA, and that came from the 1963 deal over Polaris, which Harold Macmillan and Kennedy signed at Nassau, and that sharing of nuclear technology has carried on ever since then. And whilst Britain did reduce nuclear warheads for some time, the Johnson plan is now to increase the number of nuclear warheads and build a new generation of submarines. So the relationship is actually basically a military one, and it has been that ever since not just from the formation of NATO, as I said in my contribution, from long before that as well. So is it a special relationship? Yes, in the sense that there's this close relationship at a military level, but is it different to the relationship with other countries? I think it's much exaggerated by British politicians and the British media.
Thanks both. And I've got a related question for Warren from Ursula, who asks, what's the difference between the Australian dependency
plug this in, please,
on the US to that of British behaviour?
Not much. It's possibly worse. And I think that Australia is like the sheriff of the South Pacific, and is completely at the whim of US military dictates and policy, not only militarily, but in many respects culturally. It's not a good state of affairs. There are significant numbers of US bases littered all across Australia. Pine Gap in particular has been the eyes and ears of many, and no doubt disastrous acts of war criminality. So Australia is an outpost ultimately of the US military, and AUKUS, I think, it leads it further down that path, with places like Darwin becoming a landing base and a springboard into China and into the rest of the South Pacific. So how that relationship is with the UK and the US, obviously it's kind of great dependency. The US imperialism, I think, is the most dominant force, and there's been some discussions around AUKUS. I mean, whose plan is it? I'm firmly of the view that if the US didn't want to be a part of it, it wouldn't happen. And it's in their interest, and it's basically planned around things that the rest of the panelists have commented on, to increase escalations in war, ultimately for markets, resources and profit.
Thanks, Warren. We're drawing to an end, so I've got a question for Margaret, and when she answers it, if you'd also like Margaret to take a minute to sort of summarise what you want to say to this meeting. I'll then ask Warren to do the same, just take 1 minute to sort of sum up. And I've got similarly for Jeremy, but I've also got a special question for Jeremy at the end. Can I say to the people who put in questions that haven't been answered, several of them do relate to issues in the next panel. So I hope you'll stay with us and we'll pass those questions on. So, Margaret, of course, I've now lost the question, so you'll all have to twiddle your thumbs for a moment while I try and find it. Ah, yes, here we are. And this is from Hannah Middleton. A White House spokesman recently said human rights is in the DNA of the US government. Could you comment, please?
Oh my goodness. It's so annoying to me when government spokespeople here go on and on about human rights. Human rights are pretty dismal in the United States. For example, the United States has more people incarcerated than any other country in the world, 2 million people, both the largest number of people and the largest by percentage of population. So that's an example. Police kill 1,000 people every year. We're all here talking about war. Who invaded? It's so funny to me when they all talk about values, as opposed to Russia and China. Well, neither of those countries invaded Iraq and killed 1 million people, or destroyed Libya, or any of the other things we're talking about. And they're very basic things that are not considered rights in the U.S. You don't have the right to health care. So human rights are treated as an afterthought. It's a talking point, a propaganda point, but and it's always a pretext for doing something terrible in the rest of the world. So I would hope that people listening know that they should not pay attention to any American official who claims to have some special human rights condition in the United States, when the opposite is true. But thank you so much, Carol, for bringing us all together and for inviting me. It's so important for us to discuss these issues because we are in these democratic countries. We're all very much propagandized. We're very much indoctrinated, and we have to find every opportunity we can because our views are marginalized so often, for us to come together and share ideas that are otherwise just disappeared. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Margaret. And Warren, over to you. Just a minute to quickly express your own views before we close the session.
Well, thank you very much. I'd just like to say thanks for the invite and being part of this wonderful panel and this wonderful discussion. It's really important, but it's also about movement building, and it's about action. And we, I think, are in a really positive position in being able to link so many streams of opposition to what's happening with AUKUS and this dangerous military escalation. So an internationalist approach is also fundamentally critical. And I think this is a good start to that. And we should maintain our communication, our contact, and we should look to work towards international days of action and the building of a genuine movement against this rampant neoliberal warmongering that's going on, corporate warfare, and fight together for a world of peace and social justice. So thanks very much, and I look forward to acting together with you into the future to have some victories against these horrible people.
Thanks, Warren. And just a simple question for Jeremy to sum up on. This comes from someone who is working in SOAS, name Nafisa. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Jeremy, what steps can we all take to prevent war and nuclear weapons?
Join CND, join peace organizations, and above all, don't allow yourself to be depressed by the endless mainstream media analysis that security depends on the ability to kill other people, and the greater your ability to kill other people, the more secure you are. Think of it, if your neighbor is somebody you don't know and you move into a new house, is the first thing you do to build a 10-meter high wall around your garden and put machine guns on top just in case your neighbor turns out to be a difficult person? Or do you reach out to your neighbor and talk to them? It's about human relations and about understanding inequalities within the world. And the wars that we've been involved in Iraq, in Afghanistan, are essentially wars of pressure from arms manufacturers, but also wars about depleting natural resources, which is why we've got to be so involved in environmental movements and security, and bring up the next generation to understand the reality of global history. Warren introduced his talk by talking about the native Australians, the original inhabitants of Australia, and the way they were treated. Margaret talked about the global colonial history and the slave trade, which brought so many Black people to the United States and to other places in the Caribbean and Central America. It's understanding of history that's very important. But it's also about the immediacy of campaigns. I finish with this, the contrast. Julian Assange revealed a lot of truth about what is happening around the world, about Guantanamo, about Iraq, and about so many other places. And he is in a maximum security prison in a very small cell on his own, and clearly in very bad health at the present time. And the US is trying to extradite him to the USA, and he's not been convicted of crimes in Britain. Yet he's under threat of extradition to the USA, where he'd be imprisoned for at least 150, 170 years or something like that. Tony Blair, who led us into a war in Iraq, is about to be awarded a knighthood. Well, the contrast could hardly be clearer. I know who tried to bring about peace in the world. I know who tried to tell the truth about the world. And I know that justice should mean that Julian Assange is released. And those that perpetrated the Iraq war should be asked to reread the Chilcot report on how they made those decisions and how Parliament was cajoled into supporting a war which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people. If we want to live in a world of peace, it's not going to come without a lot of effort by all of us. And that means education, solidarity, and understanding.
Thank you, Jeremy. An excellent way, I think, to end this first panel. And I hope you'll join me in saying thank you very much to all of our three speakers, and especially to Warren and Margaret, who have joined us at an antisocial time for them.
What time is it in Australia and the USA now?
About 11 o'clock.
Oh, it's not too bad. It's only 11 o'clock.
It's 7 a.m. in New York.
Oh, so you're both still wide awake.
Well, Carol, we've got to discipline ourselves. The next time we do this, it's got to be Australian time, and the time after that, US time. So it forces us to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and make a speech.
That's true. But in my own defense, I've spoken a few times in South Korea and Japan, and have also been up at 2 or 3 in the morning.
Carol, you don't need to defend your great work for the peace movement.
Okay, before we all list our heroic efforts on behalf of the movement we support, thank you again to our three speakers. You're very welcome if you're to stay for the rest of the conference if you wish. We'd love you to. We're now going to take a 20-minute refreshment and music break. I'm going to hand over now to our musicians. Just tell you who they are before I do that. We've got Nick Jeffrey, who is a peace campaigner who first came to the UK from Oklahoma, from the United States, as a Vietnam War draft resister. And Nick sang and campaigned with Jim Radford, the D-Day veteran, who he was a member of CND, a founder member of CND, and many of us know him in London CND as active to the end. And also the Gillies, that's Susan Turner and Mark Evans. They're a singer-songwriter duo in the sort of Celtic folk tradition. And that means it's folk music with a political edge. So thanks very much for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you. For those of you who need to leave your screens, it's now 12:05 by my clock, and we're going to restart the conference very promptly at 12:25. Finally, thanks once again to our three speakers. Thank you very much.
Hi, I hope you can hear us and everybody. So, yep, okay, so we're going to start off with Imagine. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no country. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. Thank you. Over to you, Nick.
Okay.
So the next song, do you want to introduce it?
Yep.
Next song is called We Don't Want Your H-Bomb.
We don't want your H-bomb, mister. We don't want your nuclear war. All we want is the right to live, mister, and live a life of peace, no fear.
We don't want your trident subsub. We don't want your mushroom cloud. We don't want our skin to blister. Nuclear missiles are not allowed. We don't want your H-bomb, mister. We don't want your nuclear war. All we want is the right to live, mister, and live a life of peace, no fear. Think me dumb if you wish, mister. Call me green or blue or red. There's just one thing I know, mister. We don't want
Our
our
babies
babies dead.
We don't want your radiation. We don't want the trump of doom. Across the world and all the nations want to see the flowers bloom. We'll organize together, mister, in one big united band, and with the red and green alliance, we will win our just demand. All together now. We don't want your H-bomb, mister. Nuclear war. Your nuclear war. Right to live. All we want is the right to live, mister. Peace, no fear. Live a life of peace, no fear. All together. We don't want your H-bomb, mister. We don't want your nuclear war. All we want is the right to live, mister, and live a life of peace, no fear. And live a life of peace, no fear. Thank you. That song was written by our late lamented comrade Jim Radford, who's one of the founding members of the CND. And the next song, we wrote a number of the verses for this. Down by the riverside, ain't gonna study war no more, which is based on the song sung by black soldiers in the US Army. So. Okay. Oh, bring me down my walking cane. Bring me down my walking cane. Oh, bring me down my walking cane. Gonna leave on the midnight train. Ain't gonna study war no more.
I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war, yes, war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside. by the riverside, I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield. Down by the riverside, study war no more. I ain't gonna 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 study war no more. I'm gonna bury that atom bomb down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. I'm gonna bury that atom bomb down by the riverside. I'm gonna study war no more. Well, I ain't gonna study war no more. 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 I'm gonna dump that trump of doom down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. I'm gonna dump that trump of doom down by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war no more. I 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 ain't gonna study war no more. I'm gonna lay down my heavy load down by the riverside. Down by the riverside, down by the riverside, I'm gonna lay down my heavy load. Down by the riverside, study war no more. I ain't gonna 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 study war no more. I'm gonna bury that trident sun down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. I'm gonna bury that trident sun down by the riverside. Study war no more. I ain't gonna 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 study war no more. I'm gonna shake hands around the world down by the riverside. Down by the riverside, down by the riverside, I'm gonna shake hands around the world. Down by the riverside, study war no more.
All together. Well, I ain't gonna study
war no more.
I ain't gonna study
war no more. I ain't gonna study
war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think we've just got time for one more song, and I'm going to hand that over to Nick. And Nick, what are you going to introduce the song? Just say
Okay, I will. Well, I'm tired and I'm so weary, but I must go alone. Oh, well, I'm tired and so weary, but I must go alone till the Lord comes and calls me away. Well, the morning will be bright, and the land will be the light, and the night is as black as the sea. There will be peace in the valley for me someday. There will be peace in the valley for me. Oh Lord, I pray. There'll be no sadness, no sorrow, no trouble I see. There will be peace in the valley for me. Well, the bed will be gentle, and the land will be tame, and the sun shall lay down by the land, and the beasts from the wild will be led by a little child, and I'll be changed from this creature that I am. There will be peace in the valley for me someday. There will be peace in the valley for me. Oh Lord, I pray. There'll be no sadness, no sorrow, no trouble I see. There will be peace in the valley for me.
Thank you very much for allowing us to take part.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Big round of applause.
Thank you.
Great. Hello, welcome back everyone. I think we've got people still rejoining us after the tea break. But just to introduce myself, my name is Hannah Kemp-Welsh and I'm the co-chair alongside Carol Turner of London CND. So our next session is going to be called Consequences of Global Britain. But we said that we would restart that session at 12:25. So I'll give people another 2 minutes as we promised them that they would have for their tea. In the meantime, if you haven't got a cup of tea, please do take the opportunity to go and grab one. It's 25 past, so I'm hoping that everyone who was here for the first session has now rejoined us with a cup of tea. My name is Hannah Kemp-Welsh and I'm the co-chair of London CND. And this session, Consequences of Global Britain, is going to be around 50 minutes long. We're going to be hearing from 3 excellent speakers shortly who are going to be talking to us about climate change, defence diversification and just transition, and where we go from here. I am a community artist in my professional life, so instead of setting the scene for this panel through some opening remarks, I wanted to instead invite you to share in an experience that I had recently that I found really heartening and which follows on from Jeremy Corbyn's remarks in our previous session about coming together as activists and continuing to find hope and strength and solidarity acting together. So I travelled to Glasgow in November last year, and together with some friends, we set up a radio station called As If Radio. It was a temporary autonomous radio station that recorded the voices of dissent around COP26, whilst the mainstream media focused on the blah, blah, blah. So using broadcasting as a tool, we wanted to document activist actions taking place around the city to create an archive to share this wider and to keep it alive. I met some really amazing people in Glasgow, including women who had walked to COP26 from Fastlane and even further afield, which had taken absolutely days, and the weather was, beyond belief, pouring down with rain during that entire time. I also met a jester who had been looking for delegates and had set up a kind of station outside of COP26, outside of the gates, to help delegates to the conference to digest what they had just experienced and to try and reformulate into taking positive actions when they were next there. I also went and hung out with a community group in South Glasgow who decided that they wanted to set up a free state in Govan, which is in South Glasgow. And they decided that this was going to be their community action in order to reclaim responsibility for their collective future. And there were also plenty of young people who were in costumes dancing outside the gates of the official site. And this coming together really felt extremely important to me. 100,000 activists marched in Glasgow to register their concern for the climate, and militarism was just such a central part of this conversation. So I've pasted together some snippets of this activism, which was taking place on the streets. Me and some friends recorded over 300 hours of audio material during that COP fortnight. So I just focused on some clips from the Day of Action on Climate Change and Militarism in front of the Royal Concert Hall in Glasgow. And I hope that this 2-minute audio piece goes some way towards conveying the deep emotion that was felt in that time, and that can serve as a sort of refreshing of the hope that we feel in the community that we found together. I'll play some audio for 2 minutes.
I'm speaking here in a personal capacity. The fact is, children are dying in Ethiopia. Yes! Children are dying in Syria. Yes! Children are dying in Yemen. Yes. Innocent people are dying in these wars. Well said. And the United Kingdom government gives export licenses on a massive scale for a massive war industry here in the United Kingdom to these companies. And that is disgraceful.
My name is Sheila Jack Babalta. I am a representative from the Mariana Islands. I am an elected official. I am here with the It Takes Roots delegation. I traveled almost 20,000 miles just to be here in Scotland.
War is obsolete. It needs to be abolished to prevent a climate collapse. In an effort to strengthen climate justice, we offer the following short petition inviting everyone around the world to sign it.
And so we walked into Glasgow for COP26. We stayed at Fastlane Peace Camp, which has been there and is still there since 1982. Talking to people along the way, and as we've been walking around Glasgow, it was quite shocking to hear how many had no idea that there are nuclear weapons literally 36 miles up the coast from here, well, the Clyde. We've got to make people aware that there are nuclear weapons on this land.
Watch the people run. Helicopter gunship.
strafing the street. Watch them lining up the bodies in the Baghdad heat.
Thank you for listening. I'm now delighted to hand over to the panel for our discussion, which is titled Consequences of Global Britain. Our speakers will share a presentation, followed by which we'll have a Q&A. If you've got any questions for the speakers, please just put them in the chat as they occur to you. And then during the Q&A section, then I will collate them and read them out and pose them to the panel. Our first speaker is Sam Mason. Sam is the policy officer at the Public and Civil Service Union, covering sustainability and climate change. She's a PCS representative on the Global Trade Unions for Energy Democracy Initiative and works closely on just transition issues with a variety of campaigns. An activist in her own right, Sam is a Labour CND committee member and an active member of the New Lucas Plan and the trade union group of the Campaign Against Climate Change. Sam is going to be addressing the theme of defence diversification and just transition. Over to you, Sam. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Hannah. That was brilliant, and it was so good to hear that sound from Glasgow and the COP, and having been part of some of that organising of trying to bring the issue of military and climate change to the COP. I think that was really successful in bringing that up the agenda. And thanks to London CND as well for inviting me along and as a representative, obviously of PCS, to address the conference today in this panel. We really appreciate that. And PCS has been a long time and very proud supporter of CND, and obviously welcome speaking at your events. For those who may not be aware, PCS does have around 6,500 members in what we call our defence sector group, the majority of those being in the Ministry of Defence, obviously on the civilian side, but we also have a number working across various parts of the defence sector, including on private contracts, and that's actually the kind of commercial bit within our PCS name. Obviously those former civil service roles that have been outsourced or privatised. I think the other thing, the panel this morning earlier was absolutely brilliant, and as a trade unionist it was so refreshing to hear Warren Smith from the Maritime Union of Australia, when compared to some of the gun-ho jobs approach, you know, jobs at any cost that we have from some of the UK trade unions, for example, and, you know, to quote the GMB, because that is who I'm talking about, who have said it is regrettable that the public debate on AUKUS has in part been based on misinformation. And I think, you know, we've got a very different view there from the Australian trade unions. I think as well, just to say at the outset, when we're talking around defence diversification and just transition, we should also differentiate between current jobs that already exist and also job creation programmes, such as how the AUKUS deal is seen by some as well, because in a way, I think we can deal with those differently. But I think it's also important when we're looking at this area that we are clearly in an era now of multiple crises: climate change, which has already been alluded to, the growth of automisation, digitalisation, and which we're seeing in some of the government integrated strategic review around cybersecurity and space and things like this, of course, increased militarisation, and obviously the COVID pandemic, which is still playing out in the acute global inequality, which has seen workers massively impacted. But I think as well, just to give a note to the current energy crisis, which I don't think has been alluded to yet, and on the back of which we're seeing a ramping up of support for nuclear power, which of course is linked to nuclear defence, and that's been very overtly stated within the government documents itself. So there's no big secret, and of course we've got thanks to some brilliant academics at the University of Sussex who've done excellent work on this and linking that cross-fertilisation agenda, which I think we need to be aware of. And of course, these are global problems which require global cooperation, global action, and an agenda for peace. And as we've seen, and as a lot has already been said, the responses to these and how we're told to understand security in today's context has been rooted in this kind of power game, but they are roosting questions of power based on elite vested interests of competition, racism and oppression to serve those very much elite interests and not wider society, and certainly not workers. So the integrated review of security, defence and development and the foreign policy announcements, including the increase of Britain's nuclear stockpile by 40%, will see billions of increase in military spending compared to investment in people and communities and the things that we need to address those multiple challenges. So it's not just an immoral and a slap in the face, for example, to NHS workers and all those that everybody was clapping over the past few years through the COVID pandemic, but it's an absolute dereliction of duty of the government and what is the real urgent things which we need to be addressing. It's also a distraction from what we need to be investing in, the scale of the challenge. If you think, the Committee on Climate Change says we need at least a £50 billion a year investment to meet our 2050 decarbonisation targets, and we're nowhere near any of that. So putting money towards things which is escalating in insecurity in the world. It is clearly not focusing on what we need. And from a trade union working class perspective, where our duties of security are, and our tradition is rooted in the protection of workers, jobs and international solidarity, it's equally indefensible. Again, when some unions are welcoming the increase in defence spending as a manufacturing jobs opportunity, there are lots of jobs opportunity within clearly the so-called green economy. So the real job security will become in defining and demanding jobs for a transition to the zero carbon economy we desperately need, and which of course is rooted in rebuilding our public services and socially and ecologically useful production. And to do so, we need to develop the institutions, but also our organisation as workers, learning from industrial examples such as the former Lucas Aerospace workers in 1976, who elaborated an alternative corporate plan in the face of redundancies due to increased capitalisation and automation of their work, and where they worked across unions through the Lucas Aerospace plants, formed shop stewards combines and collectivised their skills and knowledge to elaborate that plan based on socially useful production. And I think what was critical in the Lucas Aerospace plan was understanding that technology was political and making a conscious assessment that working in an industry that could destroy life, and of course using public money, they could repurpose their skills to make things that made people's lives more secure by making things people need, such as wind turbines, kidding machines, accessible transport, etc. And despite being told that we can't transition our economy at the pace and scale required to address climate change, for example, we've learned through the pandemic that we can quickly repurpose production lines for human needs, as we saw through the ventilator challenge and PPE, and of course there's many issues and problems around that which I won't go into, but it's more the example we could actually do this when we saw and understood the urgency of doing it. And of course it also showed us through the pandemic which jobs are important to our existence and wider human security. So as part of a wider just transition to protect workers as we move from a fossil fuel to a green economy and hopefully demilitarised economy, we advocate for the establishment of a Defence Diversification Agency that will deal with the specifics of the defence sector in an economic conversion and ensure areas wholly dependent on defence work are central to discussions in establishing the jobs needed for a decarbonised and peaceful world. And this needs to be part of a wider economy plan as part of an industrial strategy that focuses on what society needs, not destroying our environment, and is rooted in international solidarity and justice. And I just think having an Australian speaker this morning, and perhaps it's useful to end with this quote from the Kakadu traditional owners of the, I'm pronouncing this terribly, Gunja Hami Aboriginal Corporation, noting that the impacts of nuclear industry are felt for generations of people in every place it operates. And they made this statement when remembering the legacy of Fukushima disaster, and saying how they deeply saddened to learn of the ongoing increasing impact of the failed reactors on the people and country of Japan. And I think that's such an important point, because this whole industry has lasting impacts. And if we listen to the student strikers when they first came out, it's about that legacy. And what we need to do now is make sure that we have both a just transition and provide that future and secure, safe future for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. That was very important for us to hear and consider. I have lots of comments that I would make, but I think we'll leave those for the Q&A, and I'll move on to our next speaker. Bethan, Bethan's our next speaker. Bethan Siân is the National Secretary of CND Cymru, which she represents on CND's National Council. She works closely with Stop Wylfa and other Welsh anti-nuclear campaigns. Bethan herself is a climate activist. She's a member of Youth and Students CND and contributed to their recent video, What is AUKUS? Bethan will be addressing climate change. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'd like to thank the previous speakers. I certainly learnt a lot from the panel before this one, and now from Hannah and Sam's talk. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you also to Nick Jeffrey and the Gillies for the great music. Nuclear war and climate change are the two existential threats facing us today. If used, nuclear weapons have the potential to annihilate masses of the world's population and affect the ecology of the planet forever. Being at its worst in the global south, the effects of climate change can already be felt here in the UK, from floods to coastal erosion. The Westminster government is spending £205 billion on replacing Trident. This money could and should be spent on tackling climate change. It could pay to install solar panels in every home or build enough wind turbines to power all households in Britain. Nuclear weapons have been able to be developed because of imperialism. They've been tested over the Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean and the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. The decade-long US testing over the Marshall Islands that began in the late 40s led to the displacement of the island's indigenous people, many of whom are now suffering from various forms of cancer and diabetes. What happened on the Marshall Islands provides also a clear-cut example of the relationship between climate change and nuclear weapons development. The radioactive waste from the nuclear testing, which includes lethal amounts of plutonium, has been concreted into a tomb on the Runut Island. And as sea levels rise, this radioactive waste will be released into the Pacific Ocean. To tackle climate change and to help reduce CO2 emissions, the Westminster government has promised us clean energy. An increase in nuclear power, they say, is the answer. As a result, here in Wales, as in other nations in Britain, SMRs, small modular nuclear reactors, may very well be located on the decommissioned sites of Trawsfynydd Nuclear Power Station in Gwynedd and Wylfa on Ynys Môn, Anglesey, which is also in North Wales. This is greenwashing. Nuclear power is not green. It is very, very dirty. The prime product of a nuclear power plant is uranium, which can be developed into nuclear weapons or can lead to countries selling and transporting their leftover uranium. In short, more nuclear power stations equals the potential for more nuclear weapons. I'd like some clarity as to whether this would be the same case for SMRs. That is, would they use a pure enough uranium, which means that it's weapons grade? I'd be very grateful to anyone who may have knowledge on this. Nuclear power is unethical. Even before a nuclear power plant can be generated, for example, in North Wales, uranium must be mined first. And the mining of uranium takes place on the lands of Indigenous people, for example, in Australia, as well as in areas of the global south, where workers receive poor wages and the earth exploited. The very foundations of nuclear power, therefore, is a continuation of imperial exploitation. Once mined, the uranium needs to be transported to get to North Wales. The transportation of nuclear substances is not only extremely dangerous in itself, but the amount of fuel that is used in this transportation process contributes to CO2 emissions. The idea of nuclear power as a clean form of energy is therefore a myth. Nuclear power is not sustainable. Nuclear power stations need vast amounts of concrete to enclose their leftover nuclear waste. Nuclear power stations take hundreds of years to maintain, even after they have been shut down. They become an economic and environmental expense that nobody talks about. Now, this is all done when everything in the nuclear power industry goes according to plan. But what about when things go wrong? Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan in 2011 and Chernobyl in the Ukraine in 1986 spring to one's mind. The city of Pripyat near Chernobyl remains abandoned, where the population fled or were forced to flee after the disaster at the nuclear power plant. More than 1,500 miles away, the radiation from Chernobyl affected hill farming in North Wales, where radioactivity became retained in the topography of the land. Sheep had to be slaughtered, and Welsh farms remained under restrictions for a further 25 years. Radiation transcends the idea of borders. It really just depends on which way the wind happens to blow. I can't even begin to imagine the logistics of an evacuation in the event of a nuclear explosion at a nuclear power plant on Anglesey. Ynys Môn, Anglesey is an island. The Britannia Bridge, which connects Anglesey to the mainland, gets congested on a normal Thursday afternoon during rush hour. I know that my family who live on the very west coast of Anglesey will not be able to leave the island in time. Nuclear weapons and nuclear power do not allow us as nations of the UK to fully face up to our imperial past, learn from it, or to take responsibility. Britain will continue to act as an imperial power for as long as we have nuclear weapons and nuclear power stations. We must decolonise and invest in proper green energy. There are so many incredible young activists who are extremely vocal on climate change and who have been able to capture widespread attention. It would be really great if we could make links between the nuclear power industry and the nuclear military as well, and between climate change more accessible to them. A possible partnership between Youth and Student CND and the Youth Climate Movement, perhaps, with Youth and Student CND supplying climate activists with facts and figures to help speak up against nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bethan. Very important points that you've raised there about forming solidarity between groups and making those connections really clear between issues. I was reading something terrifying recently about a power station in the middle of being decommissioned that sort of ran out of money and then became a very unstable, huge, they described it as a nuclear souffle ready to explode at any time. You know, just the horrors of this are beyond comprehension. We'll maybe talk more about that in our Q&A, but I'll hand over to our next speaker. Tom Unterrainer is the newly elected chair of CND. He's director of the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation and editor of The Spokesman. an active member of his local CND group in Nottingham and East Midlands Region CND. He's also part of the European Nuclear Disarmament Movement and a contributor to End Info Journal. I'll hand over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to Sam and Bethan for illustrating quite vividly the consequences of existing British policy in the world as it relates to arms manufacturing, the continued drive to militarism, the environmental impacts of those, and also the legacies around colonialism, imperialism, and how they relate to nuclear power generation in this country. And I want to talk more about the consequences of global Britain, the impacts that it already has, and what it might mean given the global changes that are happening. And in case you couldn't guess already, the conclusion to all of this is that we live in a very dangerous scenario where nuclear tensions and the risks associated with climate change and other issues put us at a fairly acute moment. By way of illustrating this coming Thursday, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a US-based but international organization of experts, will reveal the time on their doomsday clock. For people not familiar with the concept of the doomsday clock, it's been going for many decades, but the time is set towards midnight. How many seconds, how many minutes or hours, if we're lucky, are we away from midnight, where midnight represents the potential for the complete annihilation of human life on this planet. In 2021, so in the midst of already growing nuclear tensions, in the midst of the visible effects of climate change, and in the depths of the pandemic, the atomic scientists set their doomsday clock at 100 seconds to midnight. It was at the same position the previous year and has been pretty close to midnight for some time. 100 seconds to midnight. 100 seconds from the annihilation of human life on this planet. We should all hope that in the assessment of the atomic scientists, the physicists, the environmental experts, so on and so forth, who contribute to this, we should all hope that the clock is dialed back. But I'm afraid there isn't much reason to be hopeful in that respect. And I'll hopefully illustrate why. So by looking at the consequences of global Britain and what it means internationally. Global Britain is an invention from the mind, the slogan Global Britain is an invention from the mind of Boris Johnson, which is a curious thing, really. This man who has this fantasy of Britain striding the world, having influence in all corners, in the greatest of Britain's tradition. So this man with a global mindset, and we would assume a global ambition to dominate the world. Well, if we believe what he tells us and what his ministers tell us and what sections of the right-wing press, although by no means all of them, tell us, this man with a global vision had no idea what was happening in his own house during the course of the pandemic. He didn't know there were parties. He didn't know what was happening 2 doors down. So goodness knows how he expects to stride the world and promote Britain's influence here, there and everywhere. And when I popped out for milk and some other things this morning, I'm afraid I was tempted to buy a copy of the Sunday Times. You probably can't read the headline here, but my eye caught the picture of the underwater volcanic eruption there. But I also saw the headline, Operation Red Meat to Save Johnson's Bacon. Now, one operation is already underway, Operation Big Dog to save Johnson himself. But Operation Red Meat goes into more detail about how they might do this. Operation Red Meat spells out a number of announcements over the coming weeks that will be made by the government. And one of those is to hand to the military control of what is happening in the Channel. So to hand to the Royal Navy and to Britain's military the job of stopping people who are fleeing war zones, fleeing environmental damage, fleeing hardship and poverty, who are trying to get to this country, rather than mount a humanitarian response to this, rather than put the lives and the welfare of these men, women and children, including the children who have died already attempting to cross the Channel, as a priority, we have a militarized response. A militarized response. And it's a militarized response to the consequences of Britain's military activities overseas, to the carbon blueprint of Britain and associated militaries around the world, to the slaughter, to the destruction, to the chaos in places like Afghanistan, where since withdrawal, it's on the precipice of a famine. So consequences of Britain's military activity is a militarized response, which will in itself generate more crises, more problems, more negative consequences, not just in the British Channel, but in the world. And what more than the illogic of this, more than the crassness of this, the humans, vulnerable individuals who are trying to get to the United Kingdom for whatever reason, are doing so perfectly legally. It is their right in this thing called international humanitarian law to seek safety wherever they so choose. So not only have we got a militarized response, but a potentially and probably likely illegal military response to these crises, to these consequences of Britain's existing role in the world. And yet, we'll have the Prime Minister himself and his members of his government and other politicians parading Britain's law-abiding credentials to the world. The importance of world order, the importance of rules-based world order for our safety, the importance of treaties, and the finger is pointed at those around the world by our government and their allies for those who are deemed to be in breach, whether they are or not, but in breach of these same international rules and laws. And it stinks of hypocrisy. It stinks of utter hypocrisy, but it's also incredibly dangerous. And by way of focusing in on CND's issues, let's just look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the material breaches that have taken place in terms of Britain's attitude towards that. I'll try and speed up a bit. The British government claims that it has a responsibility to uphold the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you're not entirely certain what the NPT is, then listen to the words of Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, who in 2018, which was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the, opening for signature of the NPT, he said, "The NPT is an essential pillar of international peace and security and the heart of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. Its unique status is based on its near universal membership, legally binding obligations on disarmament, verifiable non-proliferation safeguard regime, and so on and so forth." And this, the NPT, is something the British government celebrates. It's proud to be a member of it and proud to be associated with it. James Not So Cleverly, who's one of the junior defence ministers in Her Majesty's government, said this in response to a parliamentary question on Britain's attitude to the NPT. He said, "The UK's commitment to the treaty and to fulfilling our NPT obligations remains undiminished," so says James Cleverly, and other government ministers repeat much the same. But the fact of the matter is that Britain, the United Kingdom, is in breach of the NPT. Its decisions in the embodied in the integrated review in terms of increasing the warhead stockpile, of increasing ambiguity around Britain's nuclear posture, of raising questions about whether or not Britain might react with nuclear weaponry in response to non-nuclear attacks. All of these things are in non-compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And CND commissioned isn't just saying this on our own reading of what's in the NPT, although it's obvious enough, but we commissioned international law experts, legal experts, to analyse it for us. Professor Christine Chinkin and Louise Amoritsu of the London School of Economics, two world-renowned international lawyers, concluded very much the same, They wrote, in our opinion, for the reasons set out above. You can find their judgment on CND's website. The announcement by the UK government of the increase in nuclear warheads and its modernisation of its weapon systems constitutes a breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And they go on and on and on. Why is Britain doing this? Why is Joe Biden, during the US presidential campaign, Joe Biden said the sorts of things that will be spent with some of the things specified in the defence spending budget agreed by Congress and signed into law by him. He said some of those things, like usable nuclear warheads, he said they were a bad idea, yet he signed spending of them into US law. Why is he doing that? What's the connection between these two things? Well, there's global Britain, then there's the Atlantic Alliance, then there's how that corresponds with NATO, and how those states which were allied in the previously dominant military force are striding the planet. The US military was the biggest, most powerful military ever assembled on Earth, with sufficient nuclear weapons to destroy every single living creature, not just humans, every single living creature on this planet. It came a cropper in a whole number of respects. Its failed illegal war and occupation in Iraq, its inability to nation build, that's what we were told they were going to do, to deliver democracy in Afghanistan, so on and so forth. The world is changing, where that focus of power is no longer the sole focus of power on the planet. Other countries are rising economically and industrially, and in terms of their influence in the world. They have different visions about how the world should be organized. The prime example of this is China, which much of existing US and UK policy is focused upon. China is described as a systemic competitor to the US and the UK and to Western interests. There is a sharpening of tensions globally. This is where AUKUS derives from. This is what's driving the new Cold War. This is what's driving NATO's strategic doctrine. This is what is driving an arms race, where nuclear weapons are not just being updated, but whole new generations of nuclear weapons with artificial intelligence components mounted on hypersonic weapons are being produced. Every single instance of this sharpens the tensions even further. And so in terms of the consequences of global Britain, from a person in the body of Boris Johnson, who doesn't know what's happening in his own house, to his visions of dominating the world side by side with the US, we are in a very dangerous situation. These are the consequences of global Britain. And these are the consequences that we should take into account in our international and in our national campaigning. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Tom. I feel like this panel has been so wide-ranging in terms of all the issues that we have spoken about and identified. And it kind of horrifies me. Somebody asked me the other day whether or not I'm going to join the metaverse, and the fact that the sort of technological response to the feeling of doom and crisis that we're having from all of these horrendous things happening, and they're in this sort of snowballing, spiraling way, is that people are now considering ways that we can now live our entire lives from a Facebook real estate internal meta world in the internet. There seems to me to be utter insanity that, some people feel so hopeless about the state of affairs in the one world that we have, that we're now thinking of digital alternatives beyond my comprehension. We are going to move into the Q&A, so please do post your questions in the chat. And whilst you do so, I just wanted to say hello and thank you very much for coming to our friends from all around the world, because we can see that there are people here from Scotland, people from outside the UK, including Australia, and to also welcome Bruce Kent especially. Thank you very much for joining us. So I'm seeing that people are posting some comments, and there's some quite active discussion around AUKUS, around fossil fuels and renewables, around the NPT in the chat. If you have a question that you'd like to post to the panel, then please do pop that in now. It looks to me like there is some debate happening within the comments about the exact terms under which the UK would be in breach of the NPT.
There's a question in the Q&A, Hannah.
Yes.
I think people are being a bit naughty and talking amongst themselves.
Great. Thank you. So Mark Sayers is asking a question here in the Q&A. It says, my question is to Sam Mason. GMB has supported nuclear power programs for some years. It recently backed new oil rig to be built offshore of Scotland. Similar support for fossil fuel industry is no different. Then Unite Union, they have supported green transition. Unite support nuclear power program, support Trident nuclear weapons program. This was during Corbyn's tenure as Labour Party leader, and they support Heathrow Airport third runway. If these unions still support fossil fuel industry and nuclear industry, how can the peace movement get them to change tact and support proper, sustainable green energy? Sam, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I mean, that's a big question. And I think, you know, these are very active discussions that obviously we're having as part of the trade union movement and through the TUC, which obviously brings together all the affiliates and tries to get common positions. I think it's very clear, though, at TUC Congress last year, there was a motion on a range of things, but including nuclear power. And there was very much a split in our movement on that. And I would probably just say, you know, public sector unions generally opposed, not exclusively to public sector unions, but Unite GMB behind and Prospect as well, and some of the education unions, unfortunately. I think one of the problems is, and what lacks, is that we don't have a common position across our movement. And I mentioned about cooperation and planning and the need for centralised planning, without wanting to put that in particular political context, but we need centralised planning, because at the end of the day, the corporations are doing centralised planning. They may not call it that, but they are all working together on their vision. So we need to agree exactly what it is we need to do in terms of this transition. Now, unlike fossil fuels, I think the unions do agree that we don't need to invest in more fossil fuels, generally speaking. Obviously, the issues in North Sea oil and gas are slightly different, but at least in the longer term, they agree that we need to come out of North Sea oil and gas. The real problem with the whole just transition narrative is that we can call for it, we can argue for decent jobs, we can argue for social protections, but we have no mechanisms through which to achieve that at the moment, apart from workplace bargaining. And that's also a lot to do with our trade unionism in the UK, particularly, but not exclusively to the UK. In fact, it's very similar to Australia, interestingly enough. And we don't have sectorial collective bargaining, and we're not really working together collectively enough to put forward a common agenda. And this is one of the problems. And, you know, probably heard it a lot through this energy crisis. You know, the quickest thing that we can do is a retrofit and insulation of people's homes. We've got the worst, leakiest homes in the whole of Europe. And this is a debate that's been going on since the 80s. It's really depressing to see how long this has been, and we need proper public investment into that, and it would provide lots and lots of jobs. But I think one of the problems is, and just trying to refocus that question back into sort of the peace movement, I think until we've really got strong institutions and mechanisms to be able to make the transition, it's going to be very hard to obviously convince workers and trade unions as their representatives that obviously they should stop doing what they're doing. And I think that's partly why, you know, we need to work at two levels of one of current jobs that are already there, and future jobs, and where we're looking at job creation like the Arcos deal would be doing, and build that narrative, because I think, you know, we need to be putting forward the alternatives in terms of the future jobs, and we've tried very hard to do that in PCS, and things like the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign is trying to show where actually new jobs could exist, which are going to be socially and ecologically useful, protect workers as well. But we also need to look at things like our social security system, and obviously PCS represents a vast majority of members who are there delivering on social security. Now, you can't expect workers to come out of fossil fuels, for example, and then be faced with having, you know, employment support and universal credit. So we've got a whole range of things that we really need to deal with. We need to move beyond sort of just bland, and I'm talking within the trade union movement, not any comments people are making here, but, you know, just sort of slogans about we need a just transition, and we need to link that into the wider, as I said, the wider economic crisis and inequality and racism, imperialism, claim they all link together. And this is kind of what things like the Green New Deal tries to get towards. It's not just a question of dealing with climate. It's not just a question of dealing with the increased militarization. These are all connected issues, which are obviously to do with neoliberalism, the capitalist agenda. So I think that's what we have to work very hard at, but we have to obviously organise. And I think the proposal that Bethan made about linking up, you know, with the young climate movement and anti-nuclear movement is a really important one as well, because in terms of the nuclear debate, and I come across this all the time, they think it's done, they think it's finished, that was over, that was 1980s, that isn't there anymore. We need to bring back and revive a lot of these discussions.
Thanks so much, Sam. I'll, if you don't mind, but we've had another question which is along a similar vein. Sorry to direct to at you, but Daniel Blaney asks, how can CND push defence diversification to get across that we don't want the abandonment of nuclear weapons to be a weight on the shoulder of workers and local communities?
I think I'd just say to that, perhaps more quickly, I mean, there are lots of alternative jobs plans out there. I don't think there's a problem of saying there will be alternative jobs, but we really need to go into those communities and work with people at the local level. And, you know, the Labour Party on Jeremy Corbyn's leading was trying to do this, starting to do it to some extent, because, you know, we can't just have statements coming in from outside. And although it may be very, very good analysis, we need workers and communities involved in those discussions and looking at what economic diversification can happen in those areas, and see the potential for those, because, you know, some of these areas that we talk about now, they did have diversified economies. There are reasons why they've become sort of what we might call one company towns. So we need to obviously do that on a political level and as activists as well.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I spent the summer in Barrow and Furness, and, you know, it very much feels like a one company town of BAE Systems and its towering warehouses all around the city. And the thing that really sort of astonished me was that since the academisation of schools in Barrow and Furness, then these BAE Systems is able to sponsor schools and therefore influence the curriculum and provide educational resources. And I got my hands on some of these, and they were, you know, embedding sort of the creation of these the submarines as and using all this militarized language for students in their kind of maths and science activities from, you know, the age of from primary age. And so I think that there's surrounding issues around education and around other issues within towns' economies to consider within this. We have two more questions which I'm going to link together, and those are around really, I think, strategy. Somebody has pointed out how terrified we should all be by the police crime and sentencing bill. I was at a protest yesterday in central London in Lincoln's Inn Field, where lots of different left-wing groups had come together, including groups of travellers and you know, a man in a top hat with a coffin talking about UK democracy, and other groups have really come together around this. It's a big march, but people are asking, how can we stop the police crime sentencing bill? And that I'll tie into another question. Katia B asks, what do you think are the best ways to get people involved with protesting nuclear weapons and a global Britain that has a true and material effect? You know, that's really the $1 million question, isn't it? What is the most effective strategy to stop this? Panelists, any thoughts?
Can I just come in on the police bill? You know, the history of bad laws is that they are repealed or go by the wayside when there is mass defiance against them. I think if Mr. Johnson manages to hold on for the next few weeks, you know, Priti Patel will get her way, and this, given the majority that they have in Parliament, it's likely that this policing bill will become law, and I think it will need to be defied. It will need to be unworkable. I mean, you know, throughout the history of our campaigns and movements, they have attempted to criminalise the likes of us who want social progress, who want to work towards peace, who want to make, you know, stark improvements in the way society has been organised. Quite what the motivations of Priti Patel are and the government are in doing this is the subject for another discussion. But, you know, these restrictive laws were defied. We did make social progress. You know, these laws went by the wayside, and the way that happened is because people were organised, right? So the starting point for any strategy is you join an organisation, you get together with like-minded people, you talk through the issues, you make a plan, and you put that plan into action. And this is my first call of the next few minutes for, if you're not already a member of CND, for people to join, because we have got much work to do, not least defying the stupid and regressive and reactionary laws of our own government, but also in overturning their stupid, aggressive and reactionary foreign policies. And I think the two are probably intimately linked.
Thank you, Tom. Bethan, I was wondering if you wanted to say anything about reaching young people.
Yeah, sure. So obviously one way is through, I think, the climate movement, which is what I suggested towards the end of my talk. I think the second way is social media. I believe that CND need to increase their social media presence on the platforms that young people use to communicate with each other. So Instagram and TikTok are really in now. Whereas when I was a teenager, it was all about Facebook and Twitter. So I was just wondering, you know, could CND, for example, employ a young person to do their Instagram and TikTok? Something to think about maybe. Also with youth and student CND, I think it'd be great to create more videos in terms of the link between climate change and nuclear weapons and nuclear power. We did this with the AUKUS campaign as well, and Julie Sommage created a really, really cool video. It was very short and snappy. It was 2 minutes. It wasn't off-putting in the sense that it was long and boring. It was just very straight to the point and very colourful as well. So perhaps more of those kind of things need to be done as well.
Thank you, Bethan. I totally agree with some of your points. And, you know, I also think that we need to become better at speaking intergenerationally, really, because some of these structures that we have created are quite complex. You know, I certainly found I'm a Labour Party member. When I joined, you know, I was given a manual this big for the Labour Party and what it means in its internal structures. And, you know, I found it utterly baffling. You know, so kind of trying to simplify some of these things and create more accessible routes in, I think is really important. And that means that, you know, our movements have to change. You know, they can't all stay the same and expect other younger generations to adapt. They also have to be willing to adapt some of their ways. I think that's important. Final question here that we have in the chat is really about news. And, you know, I think although the question is quite specific, perhaps this could be made wider. You know, we've probably all seen and read Noam Chomsky about, you know, the news and the establishment and how that works. And I think we can all agree that, you know, mainstream media is a bit blah, 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 and has very limited perspectives and is owned by an elite few. So what can we do about this? I think that we have also sort of discovered with the rise of QAnon, etc., that, you know, the internet is not our savior for the democratization of news. And in fact, we perhaps need new strategies. So the question here from Katia is, any recommendations definitions for how to get news from an anti-imperialist perspective, particularly perhaps from Latin America and the global south. But maybe more widely, we could talk about the news and the media and narratives. Could I put that out to any of the panelists if you have any thoughts about media and news? Also a huge topic, I guess. Sorry. Thank you, Sam.
Well, I'll just start it, and I'm sure others will have things to contribute. But from a trade union perspective, I think one thing that we've stopped doing so well over a number of years is our political education. And I think that's the way, having meetings like this, and it's interesting in the online world. One, it's enabled us, as we saw earlier, to have international guests and kind of exposure, if you like, to those different views and ways which we wouldn't have been able to organise before. But also it limits us in terms of our organising as well, because I'm sure we've all found of just being in the online world, aside from how exhausting it is, that you're not having the kind of deep conversations that you might have around meetings, or meeting up in a cafe or pub afterwards and stuff like this. So but I think we need to make these very conscious efforts as well, and share really good articles and people to read on stuff, because it also can be overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming, if you just go on Twitter for 5 minutes, or you might see some articles you want to read, but it's just build our knowledge of reliable sources equally as well, because I think we could use, well, particularly Twitter at some point. I've never been particularly on Facebook, but we can't negate that act of just speaking to each other and having collectivized meetings and things as well to share our knowledge and information.
Thank you. Yes, although, the news is all owned by Rupert Murdoch, the internet's all owned by Zuckerberg and others. So, we also need alternative structures outside of these things. And, even our kind of blog hosting platforms for independent news are also entrenched in horrible data collecting. And, the internet is not free. It's an exchange for our personal data. And so some of the things, maybe we need to return to zines. I was given an excellent zine the other day about creating a pirate radio station. Maybe we need to return to some more analog strategies. Who knows? We have run out of time, so I'm going to say a huge thank you to our speakers for their wide-ranging and valuable contributions today, and also thank you very much to everyone who spent their Sunday morning in solidarity, coming together to think through some of these issues and to continue to learn from each other and debate our strategy for responding to some of these issues. I'm going to hand back over to Tom before we end for a summing up and a message from CND. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much to London CND for organising this wonderful conference. Thanks especially also to our CND workers, Rob, Julie and others who are doing sterling work on a Sunday morning to make sure that events like this can take place. So huge thank you for the collective effort, and a special mention once again to our international guests. It's incredibly important to remember that in all of our work, when you're stuck on this, I've just noticed it's started raining, when we do feel like, many of us have been, because we haven't been able to leave, stuck on this little island with a certain person as Prime Minister, we are not alone. In every corner of the world, in every city, village, town, neighborhood, the peace movement is there. There are peace movements across the globe. We're an international movement, and our solidarity is incredibly important, and long may that be the case. Second time I'll say it during this session, if you are not already a member of CND, join. If you haven't donated for a while, then donate. And these are two incredibly important things. If you take anything that has been discussed and considered here at all seriously, because we only make change through collective effort, we only make change when we are organised, and we have a lot of change to make. CND has, our overriding priority above and beyond everything else is to rid this country and the world of nuclear weapons. We want nuclear abolition, and we work towards that in our everyday activity. And when faced with the sharpest and gravest of threats, when faced with an ever-changing set of global circumstances, when new threats arise, you need an organisation like CND to make sure that we have the best possible response. So going again from the global to the local, as part, we're involved in very many things, but I want to highlight and flag up a few of them. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which hopefully everybody here has come across, was one of those instances when our international movement said, no, we have had enough. We've had enough of the nuclear armed states prevaricating. We've had enough of them not living up to their responsibilities. We've had enough of their lies, to be quite frank, and we are going to take our own initiative on a global scale to make steps towards abolishing nuclear weapons. We need, in this country, we live in a nuclear armed state. We live in one of the key components of the nuclear alliance that exists across the Atlantic and across Europe and beyond. So we have a special responsibility to make sure that our government is held to account on it's not just its refusal to sign the TPNW, this treaty, but its efforts to undermine that treaty. So we are demanding that the UK government actually sends representatives to a meeting of the states parties of this global ban treaty coming up in Vienna later this year. They need to attend as a very first step, and other NATO member states are making decisions to send representatives. The new German government, for instance, is doing so. So if Germany can do it, the UK can do it. We're also building momentum around the nuclear ban treaty by encouraging communities, towns and cities to sign up to a city appeal. I know that London CND has been doing a lot of work on this to make sure the various boroughs in London are signing up and taking that pledge. I would encourage others to get involved and to do activity wherever they are in the UK to make sure that other communities follow likewise. Because one of the biggest challenges we face is to make sure that we systematically delegitimize nuclear weapons and the military agenda that they embody. And these are all steps towards doing that. Speaking of delegitimizing some of the lies that our government and others perpetuate, the issue around nuclear power generation, which Bethan spoke so forcefully on earlier, are very, very important. Billions will be invested into new generations of nuclear power. This dirty, dangerous, inefficient, unworkable, and deadly, potentially deadly means of producing electricity. I was flabbergasted to see statements coming out of COP26 describing this as a green energy source. And so much work needs to be done to, again, delegitimize this. But as with everything, CND is part of an international movement, it's part of a national movement, also in terms of holding our government to account about its militarism and responding if and when the drive to war tilts over into actual war itself. And we face risks of that on a day-to-day basis. So for all of those reasons, CND is a vital and important organisation. Third and last time, if you're not already a member, then make sure you join, contribute to our work, both with your ideas, your energy, and financially also, because our campaigning doesn't have billionaire backers. Our campaigns are based on the contributions of our members and supporters. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to Carol, Hannah, and the London CND team for making this happen. Thank you to Julie and Rob for making everything work technology-wise. We have much work to do, and I hope to see you again very soon in the struggle. Thank you.
Thanks from me. Goodbye, everyone.